welcome to Blind Shovel, an arts and music podcast. Today's a little different. Today, JF Martel interviews me about my recent release, Saints and Sand, a book of visions, or a book of songs, as JF puts it. If you don't know who JF is or who I am, there are prior Blind Shovel episodes that do address that. Thank you for listening. Am I whispering? Does it appear that I'm whispering and trying to not wake up a child?
No, you sound calm, collected.
It must be that. Must be it.
Yeah. But I remember those days. You miss them after a while. You miss those days.
Well, I can only imagine you do, because
yeah, it's amazing.
He's in another place, you know?
Yeah.
And he won't be... Soon he'll enter into, like... not the mundane world, but this world. And that'll be the majority of his life. But right now he's fresh out of whatever other world, and it's fascinating. I don't understand how people don't connect immediately. I've heard some men claim that it took months or even years to really connect.
I remember hearing that from other dads, that they didn't really connect until the child was speaking, which
it must be spiritually retarded. That's all I can say.
Well,
or maybe I am. And so, like, the moment I felt it kick, then I connected.
Yeah.
But before that, of course, it's a little more abstract. But
but that's pretty early when they kick.
Yeah.
But I felt the same way. It was like when I have two daughters. When the oldest was born, well, both times, but I obviously clearly remember the first time because it's so surreal. I felt like I'd met her before. In fact, I did meet her before. Just around the time when my wife decided that she was pregnant and we went to get a pregnancy test. And just around that time, I'd had a dream of meeting my daughter. But in my dream, she was like 20 years old. Mm-hmm. And it was at a cocktail party. And she was wearing a dress. And it was like a really formal sort of affair. And I spoke to her. And in my dream, this was my daughter. And at the time, I was in my early 30s. So she was like only about 12 years younger than I was in the dream. And I told Leslie, my wife, after I said, I dreamt of our daughter. And so when she was born, like 9 months later, it felt like a confirmation. And in fact, now she's 14, and I look at her and she's looking pretty close to the person I remember from that dream. So it was really weird. So I felt all this to say that when she was born, I felt like I'd met her before. And I felt the same with Fiona, although I did not have a precognitive dream of her. Anyways, it's a very surreal time, and in a sense, they kind of live in, for lack of a better term, in the spirit world. I've been thinking about the whole mind-body problem, in philosophy, the hard problem of consciousness, and how does the mind connect with the body, and reading some Henry Bergson, and Bergson puts it pretty succinctly. He's like, the problem is badly posed. The problem is not posed correctly when we separate the mind and the body. What we need to separate is quality and quantity. He says that's an actual, like, irreducible difference. And then you read about how, psychologists imagine babies see the world, and you can kind of, like, we've all been there, so you can kind of intuit it. All they see is pure quality, right? Pure becoming, pure kind of like being. They don't count things. It's like immediate. And it's not that they don't make distinctions between things, because obviously they do, because things are distinct. But they experience them and I don't know. reading Saints and Sands, I was thinking about this. It's like I was thinking this is like the precognitive experience of Christianity lived by a fetus in the womb. That was one thought. I mean, I'm sure that's not what your intention was, but that did, because the book is just pure quality in that sense. Do you understand what I'm saying by quality?
No, I don't actually know what quality would mean in that context.
Quality, not quality in terms of like
this is a quality product.
No, but quality in terms of qualia in philosophy, like redness, as opposed to a particular oscillation of light that produces the phenomenon reported to be red. Like just the redness of red, which is something that philosophers can't, and neuroscientists can't really explain how that could emerge from.
Yeah. It's like the unmediated itness of, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, the suchness of something.
I guess that is something, even with having a child. That's one of the easiest ways for me to talk about this. The shift is so much of modern life is mediated, and perhaps this is a problem I have, but like as if there's a screen between you and it. Even like sunsets can look like screensavers, or moments can evoke movie references.
Yeah.
And despite everyone says a lot about having a child, etc., but certainly in the early weeks that all of that didn't exist. And you can experience this love in this child directly.
Yeah.
Of course, the mind emerges later on, but I still feel that that's very true, that it's an unmediated love. And I do think people before certain problems of modernity experience that a lot more, especially in respect to God. And I think the book certainly plays with those problems.
Yeah.
I think, it was when I was church hopping a bit, this book, over the course of 3 years, that was probably in the middle of the book where I was going back to church, but being dissatisfied for many reasons that I now put aside, I think.
Right.
That I don't think, like, aesthetics became a block. It's funny to talk about in this context, but I've had to put aside certain aesthetic vanities to enter into true community.
Yes, I know what you're saying.
It can be really much Luciferian in that sense. Obviously, it's a very vain thing. The very sensorial place sometimes, the arts. There's a reason it attracts certain types of behavior and certain types of people, at least in its modern context. And I was saying at the time that if I was, and I did interview someone who works on churches on Blind Shovel, and we were talking about how in Europe it's kind of easy to enter into the spiritual space almost aesthetically first. It's almost too easy in a sense, but in America and probably in Canada, the churches can be really garish and just like hard, marbly, and the proportions don't seem right. It seems like it's mimicking a logic and language that people used to live in.
Yeah.
And now it's like as if someone had like an amateurish understanding of those geometries.
Yeah. That's very well put. You're absolutely right. I think it feels like an echo of something.
Yeah.
We had this issue. It wasn't so much that like when we moved to Ottawa with our very young children from Toronto, we started looking for a church, and there's the one in my parish, which is actually the church that I grew up going to. It's where I had my first communion and everything. Aesthetically, it's interesting. It's very modern. It burnt down in the 70s, so they rebuilt it, and they built it very modern. So it kind of looks like kind of looks like a flying saucer. It's got an interesting design, and inside it's a lot of wood and wood paneling on the ceilings and beams. It's quite nice, actually. If it was like a ski lodge, it'd be the best ski lodge ever. But as a church, it just, but that wasn't really the reason we didn't go. It was more because, well, first of all, the mass there is only in French, and my wife is Anglophone, so we were looking for. So we went to this one church that's near the university here, and it's a nice place. But eventually, we went to the cathedral just for one. It was for Christmas Mass, and my daughters were quite young, but they were kind of blown away by the choir and the statuary and just the intensity of it all. And it's a very beautiful cathedral. It's a French Canadian cathedral, and it was built in the middle of the 19th century by real, like, true artists. Like, you can tell that the proportions are really good. And so we just kept going there. And so I always say that for me, the aesthetic is important. And I see what you're saying when you talk about aesthetic vanities. It is true that that's not the point. But when the aesthetics align with everything else, it can be, given the choice between a strong community with a beautiful church and maybe even a slightly stronger community with a less beautiful church. I'll go to the beautiful church.
Yeah, and I think at least in my journey with art, there was a kind of inhumanity to how I made art in my 20s, and perhaps in this sense I conflate them as opposing forces somehow. I felt that I don't know, it made me subhuman when I was really in it, but I think I was probably making it wrong. But I think there's an abstraction quality that occurs in art making that doesn't always lend itself towards humanity. I don't know how to word that. Like, I think emerging out of that fog that happens when you're making things, there's a reason I think there's a stereotype that artists can be kind of like grumpy and disconnected. Perhaps that sense of control that they have, that illusion in that moment, pushes them away from God in some sense, I think. I'm probably speaking about how I made art more than anything.
Well, but I think the experience is shared. I certainly felt that way when I saw myself as first and foremost an artist when I was writing screenplays and writing novels in my 20s. Very determined to make my mark in those fields, but just didn't have the drive ultimately to carry it through and to develop as I should have. But anyways, another story. But I remember the satisfaction, like a great success in art doesn't always feel like a human success. It feels like, I do think there's something about art, modern art specifically, that is about becoming, you said inhuman. I think that has a moral connotation. I don't necessarily mean that way, but a non-human or kind of like a post or subhuman orientation. That it's really about becoming the object. Right?
Well, it is often a doubling or tripling down on your idiosyncrasies, and at least how I've been looking at Christianity lately, it is not what makes you unique that is the focus. It's quite the opposite. It's the things that bind you and join you. It's the commonalities. Right. It's the overcoming of the otherness of these people or these people who are unaccepted. And so it's really about bridge building, not like island building. And so idiosyncrasies, I think in my 20s, I heavily identified with what made me different, which I think was somewhat pathological, because and what really shatters that, in my opinion, is having a child, because especially my generation thinks they're either above or below the act. Mm-hmm. But once you have it, everything clicks. You
Totally.
understand your parents, your grandparents, all
Yeah.
of humanity itself, and you understand that you are not so different. And now you're modeling those
Yeah.
behaviors. And
Yeah.
so you're straight up and down the line a human. And there's nothing you can do anymore to avoid that.
That's very well put. I totally agree. You know, I remember around the time when we were having kids, there were lots of articles coming out about the childless marriage and all that, like the beauties of a childless life and how they've run, you know, they've done some studies and discovered that people who don't have kids are happier and
Yes.
that sort of thing, which only a person without a child could write. Yeah. Because it's not so much that you're happier with children, it's that your happiness isn't so important when when you have children.
Exactly.
It's not so much about feeling happy
No.
anymore, you know?
Perhaps it's a. I was listening to something the other day that was saying it's about holiness, not happiness. In
Right.
fact, it might even in marriage you may be less happy, but it's actually not the purpose. It's not a hedonistic venture. Um, I was also reading something by Bishop Fulton Sheen about how any pagan framework is a life in decline. Things only get worse. When you sexually decline, you physically decline, you mentally decline. And his book is about how marriage is always involves a third element, obviously Christ,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a active ascension, and that children are that kind of reverberation and recursive, I guess, proof of the
Right.
love, and it just keeps spreading. And in that sense, you don't die or you don't decay.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, I guess if I'm being like technical about it, I feel like the sheer vitality of a child outruns any of the backaches that you experience having to carry them around in the first. I'm only 6 months in here, but
Yeah.
I feel like they don't compete.
No. No.
It's not really. It's hard to talk about.
Yeah,
Uh,
it is. But you know, I look at my wife's family is a big Irish family, so there are 5 kids. My sister-in-law has 6 kids.
yes.
And you know, we have 2 kids and we started later, so there was no way of. But if I were to do it again, I would probably go for as many kids as well, as obviously as Leslie feels like having there first and foremost. But the thing is that there's something about a big family, and you feel it. You feel that this initial, like I look at my in-laws, and you know they met, you know, was it over 50 years ago, and they decided to make this move to get married. They started a L'Arche home. I don't know if you know L'Arche. It's a
No.
movement. It's a Catholic movement that's basically they build homes for people who with shit. What's the term now? Developmental disabilities.
Okay.
So people they build these big homes and they live together. It's like a really beautiful movement. Anyways, so my father-in-law started one of these places, and the kids were raised there. And but when everybody gets together, and I just look at my father-in-law just sitting there, and my mother-in-law sitting there amidst all these children, there's like so many people now. It's kind of amazing. It's almost like watching an explosion, you know.
Yeah, in slow
You know, it's
motion.
just yeah, exactly, and all emanating from this moment, this decision they made. And it's kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I had this. I don't know why it hit me. And I went to Disney World, whatever's in Florida. I don't know. Disneyland.
Disney World is Florida. Disneyland is California. I've always been
Copy.
told. Yeah.
I was like 25. It was the first time I ever went there. It was a bizarre journey.
That must have been weird at that age. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was sitting alone at the front of It's a Small World, looking like I look, you know. That's a different part of it. I just remember seeing or being struck by the scale of family, like from an aesthetic perspective, the formal quality of scale, and realizing in some sense that that is like I think about obviously composition. It's probably my strength at drawing is some composition. I don't think I'm great at my line work is whatever. I'm really there to present an image and to think about composition.
Yeah.
And I just realized, wow, when I looked at this child with their parent and they just looked very similar, but they were tiny,
Right.
it struck me as very impactful and that it must have meant something deeper about how you should live or could live life in the most beautiful way possible.
Agreed.
And obviously then you have iterative things. If you have 6 kids, you then have these little, melodic variations on each partner. It's so stupid that I even have to, I'm not trying to convince anyone, obviously, but
Yeah.
this is a foundational, fundamental act. I wouldn't exist if my parents didn't participate in such an act.
Right.
It feels like a politicized thing, like everything else today. But yeah, I feel like an idiot, even having come to realize, having my first child at 35, I don't regret my prior decisions or the time it took me to get there. But again, I think that doubling down on those idiosyncrasies really blinded me to the common good and just the wisdom of what is fundamental.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've come around to seeing things much in that way as well. And so okay, so let's pivot to your book here.
Yeah, I think
So
for
when-
me to describe,
Yeah.
there was things happening, right? I did
Yeah.
finish the book when my son was maybe 2, 3 months old. I was trying to get it done before that, didn't happen. So there's definitely drawings that start to play off of that, but there's drawings made when my wife was pregnant, and then there's drawings made before that time. But there is the journey that occurred back to a more religious framework, which, as I think about it as an artist, I think I'm drawn to those structures and those institutions largely because I want to kind of push to the edge, maybe to understand them more, but maybe to be a brat too.
You get to be a brat if you're part of something.
Exactly. And I don't like the vagueness and nebulous quality of like spirituality. So,
Right.
And honestly, I think, at least in Catholicism, many saints or many important figures are nuisances and brats and not recognized as valid by the in the moment they're in. And in fact, often considered heretics, and then
Later.
yeah. But I think that's built into the logic of Christianity. I think there isn't, the thing I think about most is the inversion quality. Everything is inverted. High is always becoming low and being flipped. And in fact, very vile people from a moral standard are being chosen. So there's always this turning of the soil. So it seems like, it's just natural that.
Yeah. I feel in a way what Christianity did, if you want to look at it kind of like metaphysically, but not theologically necessarily. If you want to look at what they managed to create, was a religious machinery that was able to assimilate and metabolize what the Greeks called enantiodromias. Do you know what that means? Enantiodromia? It means a reversal. It's a big word that means something really simple.
Yeah.
So when you push something to its limit, it reverses into its opposite. Yep. Right. So, and that was always the doom of the pagan world. When things reach their limit, they collapse. The Stoic world, the Stoic universe, it's a conflagration. It just destroys, or Ragnarok for the Norse, just everything burns. And then it just starts over. Whereas Christianity found this weird way of recognizing how things reverse and just kind of incorporating that into its structure. That's why the book of Revelation, which is such a weird book, and they really hesitated from what I've learned, from what I've read. They really hesitated before including it. I think some of the people at the councils thought that it was a heretical or dangerous book. In the end, they decided to incorporate it. And the reason I think that's a good idea, I'm sure they had all kinds of good reasons, is specifically that it's showing you the shadow of the religion. It's showing you the underside. It's showing you what things become. But by stating it at the beginning, you kind of inoculate the church against it to a certain extent, so it can recognize its shadow. Like, you need an antichrist. You can't just have. You need a figure of the antichrist, so that when all the little antichrists in life come up, you have a name for those people. It's kind of like it affords a measure of kind of like immunity to the religion. Now, that didn't stop it from fragmenting into 10,000 pieces.
Yes.
But maybe that's kind of the point. It continues to metastasize.
It isn't clear what the. Just like in one's life, if one does what's right, it doesn't mean you will even necessarily flourish.
No.
If larger entities, if the church does what's right, quote unquote, the outcome isn't guaranteed. There's no particular outcome that's guaranteed, at least as I understand it. It's a different rule set. And I think something that actually cemented that for me, although it's not quite analogous, is Obi-Wan's decision to let Darth Vader kill him. And when you're young, you're like, what the fuck is that? Like, he didn't even try.
Right.
And I suppose maybe I was just being very materialist at the time, but I still, when I was young, I'd be like, well, okay, he's a ghost that can tell Luke stuff, right, but is that better than being alive? It is, but that idea when I was little is so, it really cements a lot of things for me. Like that sacrifice that Obi-Wan does.
Well, he knows he's making something. He's making Luke, right? He's giving Luke what he needs to do.
But it isn't even clear if it's like a strategy, like, oh, I'm old and I need to, like, I'm not going to win this fight. I might as well, die in a particular fashion.
No.
That's what I mean, is like, I don't even know if strategy, like, for instance, like you said, like, he would have had as many kids as humanly possible. I know people at my church who have 9 kids and they're still going. They're not strategizing. They're not like financially.
No,
it's not a strategy of anything other than what they believe to be right.
Right.
And so that tension, I don't know if this manifests in the book because I can't read it neutrally. But I try to represent at least the tensions I was trying to resolve over the course of those years. But also, it started as a book of drawings for churches that I would, imagine myself building when I was like 60. But then they became, I don't know, the journey of the book itself is odd and different than any other book I have.
It's got it is very different from your other books, but it's a really beautiful evolution. If you I was looking at it alongside your other books that I have, and it's really nice to see. Like, but I do feel like there's a tremendous amount of tension in this book, a kind of almost like Manichaean struggle.
I'm big into that word that is so derogatory in academic circles, Manichaean. I think.
I mean it as a compliment.
Yeah. Look how it shimmers in the bottom left corner of your. There's just a fascinating shimmering. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's quite a beautiful book too. Like, it's beautifully bound.
It was well produced. I have to thank them for producing it well.
Yeah, it is amazing.
But yeah, Manichaean has always struck me as, like, I know it's considered lowbrow in some sense, but it seems like the bedrock problem to me. It isn't about, first off, if anyone understands Christianity, it's not about people being, one person being evil and then this person being good. There's certainly the quality of being possessed by things.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's very much the opposite, I feel, if you actually take it upon good faith to to read and analyze the text. I don't know the particular beliefs of the Manichaeans, but as I understand it, it's just the notion that you, at the core, you have a good versus evil problem on your
Yeah.
hands.
And ultimately the kind of rift or the brokenness goes scales all the way down to the quantum level and all the way up to the astronomical level. And of course, humans are right in the middle. What I mean is that the divide is everywhere. In a sense, that when you say like creation's fallen, what we mean is that it's broken in that way. And so the Manichaeanism is simply just evenly distributed across all things, as opposed to being seen solely as a kind of cosmic thing. And I'm not very familiar with what the actual Manichaeans believed.
Yes.
I have a sense that it was probably a lot more subtle and interesting than the caricature that we imply when we say the word Manichaean.
I think it's just used like
Yeah.
you're goofy and silly for thinking there's good and evil. Like you're goofy for
Right.
thinking those things exist, which is, yes, I do think that exists. And
Yeah.
and I would say that it's not a coincidence that I make most of my books black and white, and this book is black and white because that's the easiest visual representation of that thing.
Yeah. Of that kind of ambient war at the heart of things.
I'm glad gold got in there too, because I think that is the third element.
Yeah. Yeah, probably the most important one, but you lose the minute you crack open the book. You lose the gold. You're just in the black and white and having to live the struggle. It's a really fantastic piece of work. I mean, so I have kind of a few just kind of basic, boring questions, but interesting to me is, did you print them? Did you order them sequentially? Like, I mean, chronologically? Like, was this the first picture you made?
No.
No?
I went through the process of printing them out really tiny and then pairing them.
Right.
And doing my best to distribute across those 3 years, just like, for me, some stylistic changes or thematic changes. And obviously things change a lot when it becomes a diptych. I didn't think they would be diptychs initially. Right. So there's then the relationship between the two images.
Again, there's that two-ness or Manichaeanism.
Yeah, which I love.
The diptych form of because you're always looking at two images.
It's also obviously like the primordial goo of comics. It's just, you know, you could put a photo of an apple next to a photo of an orange, and now you have a relationship. And the Trinity is obviously predicated in this notion as well, and in this idea of the three. No, it's not chronological. It is not overtly relational either. I'm not saying, sometimes things play with each other, play off each other, undermine each other, augment each other. That was more of an intuitive process.
Right. Okay. So another question I had was, you have several leitmotifs in here. You have a lot of what look like little unborn fetuses popping up.
Oh, there's a lot of fetuses. I think part of the book for me, and I don't know if I put that in my writing, is, if I did, I forgot to put it in the book, is I wanted to take symbols. Oh, wow. Yeah, I should have put that in if I didn't. I think there's a propensity in the scene I was in or am in, I don't know anymore, to use esoteric and occult symbols.
Right.
And because they're cool looking, they're like objectively cool looking, I would say. But I wanted to respect them and say, well, one, I don't know what a lot of them mean, so I shouldn't be using them.
Right.
And I'm not being like overtly literal here. I'm just trying to, I don't know, in some sense, understand the origin of it. And so I wanted to go back to crosses, hearts, like things I would never have drawn 10 years ago because I thought they would be lame.
Right.
So again, there's that inversion. And then I was like, fetuses or babies. Obviously, a fetus is kind of a scientific term. I wanted to put them in a light that I'd never seen before in art. which is not some kind of, I mean, I can imagine like feminist art using a fetus in some way or manner, but that's certainly not necessarily what's going on there. I just wanted to draw things that would challenge me to make images I was confident about using these symbols that are often kitsch, basically.
Yeah, it doesn't feel kitsch. That's
that's a definite goal in the book, is to reintroduce those symbols and
to renovate them, to rejuvenate them. And I really do think it works that way. What about I noticed some terotic is the very pretentious adjective, meaning like evocative of tarot. Was that conscious, or was just working with archetypes, and so like towers creep in and chariots and whatnot?
I've made it a point to, again, I would say that's part of that bushel of things that were aesthetically alluring, but I have a tarot deck. I studied it briefly, and then, it felt like a put on in some ways. They're undeniably wonderful. I love Italian playing cards as well. And there's a kind of lineage even with playing cards in general. Yeah. They're undeniably dense and beautiful, but no, there is no reference except for the fact that, like, biblically speaking, mountains represent the same thing over and over. Right. Cities do. I mean, all these things get inverted. The city of God versus kind of the hedonistic representation of a city, which is everywhere else. No, there is no conscious exploration of the tarot.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you have, like you said, hearts.
I wanted to use the least cool things, like even crosses. The way I use words. I'm not trying to be ironic, but writing good, evil, or faith, because part of my concern was, and I think you and I have talked about it, like being a Christian artist, the kind of calcifying identity of that, or whatever, Christian music, this kind of, I do view it as political. It feels like it's weaponizing a thing to fight a certain war I'm not interested in.
Right.
Whereas opposed to, you would have found, I don't know, thousands of artists of the millions of the past who are Christian that make art that has no.
Right.
It's not just like, it's not limited in this sense.
It's not. It's not using. It's doing what art does, but in a Christian universe. I think Flannery O'Connor wrote a really great essay on the difference between a Christian writer and a writer who is, well, in her case, Catholic. I need to dig it up because it's been a long time, but Donna Tartt wrote something very similar. She's also Roman Catholic. And they're both expressing something like, if you're actually Catholic, like if you live in that universe, why would it be necessary for you to make sure that you're coding that into your work?
Yeah.
I
mean, I think in that sense, it also, I often kind of jokingly would attribute the fact that I would go to sleep at night and think of going to hell and all that implied, since I was very young, for the fertile soil of what I draw, which can often be, especially in the past, very kind of demonic. And by that, I mean concerned with demons. I wanted to readdress that with this book too. Like, I think I fail sometimes, maybe succeed other times, but I wanted to take some stabs at beauty in whatever way I could in this book that I had no concern with before.
But you're still in the same aesthetic territory in the sense that you're not overly concerned with like the golden mean or of traditional ideas of beauty. It's very much a kind of avant-garde comic. Kind of picks up where you left off aesthetically. It's not like you've taken this complete like 90-degree turn and are now making it. It still feels like there's continuity between this, and I still sense a kind of demonicness in here.
There's plenty.
Although,
There's
yeah,
plenty, and it's smuggled into contexts that are supposedly benevolent at times. I think
yeah,
if one's being honest with themselves, and this again is not contradictory. Some of the most demonic things find their ways into churches. This is,
yeah,
and you have to kind of always, and with that turning of soil, I think it means you will never settle. And I think that's part of the adventure of Christianity is there's actually no, despite, in some sense, it might be the most stable thing you can interact with. In this world, it's an incredibly unsettling
yeah,
life.
yeah.
And of course,
Agreed.
the life of the saints is often they're horrible by any pagan metric. And well, that's where it kind of clicked art-wise to me. It's like,
Yeah,
this is playing with these symbols without a lack of, or with a lack of concern that I still have to show my priest this book, but that my priest might think it's blasphemous
yeah.
or, you know, that's important to me. And it's not as if I have no, I mean, like what I was saying about earlier is like, it isn't like a Christian book or made by a Christian artist, quote unquote. In that sense, from a market perspective, a financial perspective, I have no idea who I would market this book to.
Who is it for? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And I guess I'm going to learn through trying to
yeah.
sell them. But to me, that unsettled quality is important. That, yeah,
Huh.
it was inevitable in some sense. I don't know how I would have made one book or a book to please one audience or the other in this context. But I am curious if it inspires suspicion or like, I don't think it's going to convert anyone. That
Well,
I don't know.
we don't know. We'll
It's,
see.
yeah, yeah.
But it's certainly honest, and it's honest with the symbology. It's you say at the end, you're afterward, you say it's not personal.
Well, it's the most personal thing I've made in some
Yeah.
weird way, but it isn't like, it's not about
No,
the personal.
in my in the little foreword I wrote for it, I compare it to like the decadent movement, and I still think that if I had to like catalog this, place it in the history of art, I think that there are resonances between this book and something like J.K. Huysman's Against the Grain, or Lautréamont, Les Champs de Maldoror, that sort of thing. Not necessarily in terms of its content, but the spirit of it, which is, I really do think that what the decadents were concerned with, a lot of them unconsciously at first, but many of them consciously by the end, including Huysman, was that the reason they went into the darkest places, the reason they allowed themselves to go down into the demonic, was to find the means, find a way of affirming the vertical axis, which everyone else in their time was telling them didn't exist.
Right.
And so, having found hell, a season in hell, then you can at least affirm the vertical axis that goes the other way. And what that movement ended up doing, at first it was reviled certainly by clergy, by just mainstream critics. The decadents were just these horrible punks who were making terrible, immoral art. A lot of them were, Oscar Wilde, of course, was put on trial, not specifically for his art, but it was used as evidence against him. And but the net effect of their movement was a lot of people awakening to the spiritual dimensions, and the old wisdom which in our obsession with novelty, we're quick to dismiss, a kind of reaffirmation of.
Well, that is the funny
Yeah.
thing in a sense, is that I admit that it's a kind of a tricky one, because I'm not interested in making Renaissance art, obviously, and nor am I probably capable at this point in my life. But it is, in a sense, novelty seeking. There is a sense of, because I do think most art that's worth making has to have some level of innovation, or at least strive for that. But again, you're dealing with, I guess it's just that balance.
Well, you're looking, it's like that line from Revelation, behold, I make all things new, It's that a great artist is someone who takes something that we thought we knew and suddenly we see it and we don't know it anymore.
Right. That's all I would like to do. Yeah. I think that's it. I'm not saying I'm a great artist, but I think even fetuses for me, which are quite prevalent in the book, like, I despise you can feel one way or the other about the notion of abortion, but just the framing often used by materialists is, I think, disingenuous and weird, like a clump of cells. Okay, that may be true from some perspective.
Well, it's true of all of us from some perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all clumps of cells.
I'm a sack of meat. And, and I just want a reconsideration of certain things in there,
Right. Yeah, that's this kind of restoration or restorative or like rejuvenating move, I think, is really effective. Taking things like a shepherd's crook,
I like the crook a lot.
Yeah.
I like spirals. So like,
yeah,
that was a very important, still is in the books I'm working on right now. The kind of notion of an infinite, spirals are just very fascinating.
Yeah.
It's kind of, because they kind of haunted me when I was young. Remember
spirals did?
Or infinity. I remember my mother telling me, I made a graveyard out of like those like Halloween candy tombstones or whatever from Halloween. Right. I don't know how old I was, like 8 or 10 and I wanted to know where her father was, my mother. He died before I knew him. And she explained, and I was almost more horrified, and I still am to this day in some sense, about the notion of perpetual heaven or infinite time.
Yeah.
And the spiral for me represents, there's elements of that. Mm-hmm. This just, I actually believe that, I don't think spirals, I think you either go up or down as well. I think
I was going to say,
there's a Geyer quality, but yeah, I don't think that, I think it's cynical to think things are just circular and never ending.
That line from True Detective there.
Yes.
Time is a flat circle.
Yes.
On page 111, there's a beautiful example of your spirals.
Oh, so like a snail-headed.
Yeah. Snail shell-headed person.
I like that idea. There's a couple snails. There's some snails. Snail going to church.
Yeah.
there's So I really did try to stick with the certain fundamentals, and that's kind of how I draw. Is like a hieroglyphic. Yeah. Dressed up hieroglyphics, I suppose.
Diagrammatic is that?
Yeah. Yeah. But I still want to set them in a kind of space often.
Yeah, you can't do otherwise. I agree. I think a real diagram always ends up being a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional space. There's a clash of forces is what I mean by that, is that what you're seeing is, if you look at it musically, you kind of like go through different ways. Like when I look at pictures, first of all, I look at them conceptually. Okay, what's in the picture? And I see, okay, you've got eyeballs, cross-like structures, question marks. I'm looking at the image on page 115 right now. And then I look at, okay, here's another one that comes up again. Another leitmotif is the ones and zeros.
Yeah.
What's that about? Well,
good and evil and the
Right.
binary.
The
So
binary, right?
yeah, it's that those things are etched into everything, and
Yeah.
also a concern about how, whatever's coming, digitally speaking, plays in those spiritual worlds. I think there is one drawing that's almost like a kind of AI in space reading the Bible.
Hmm.
Um, I
Did
don't,
I ever tell
yeah.
you about one of the kind of, really formative kind of moments involved in my slow return
Mm-hmm.
to religion in my early 30s was I went to and I did this ayahuasca retreat,
Mm-hmm.
and on the second night I had this crazy vision of this gigantic spaceship. This thing was really like really high definition, very high def vision of this gigantic, starship with like a giant cross on it and all this kind of iconography on it. And there's a voice in ayahuasca that's there answering your questions. And so I asked, "What's this about?" And the voice said, "It is a young religion." And that struck me at the time because at the time, to me, Christianity felt old and worn out and exhausted personally, because I'd grown up in a
Yeah,
very
yeah.
kind of like reflexively, like you're Italian American, I'm French Canadian. We grow up in this religion and it feels like it's just cultural, right? Or at least it did for me
Yeah,
when I
yeah.
was a
Well,
kid.
which is, I think, is good. I think that those I've known who've been raised fanatically hate it. Those who've just been raised in it ambiently can
Yeah,
return.
at
Yeah,
least, yeah, because there's no pressure, right?
yeah.
So, so but to me at that time, I was very much in the same space you were in your 20s, just not interested in going there. Although I felt this weird draw to it, this weird, even throughout my 20s, I felt this weird. Whenever people around me started to shit all over
Yeah.
Catholicism, I would always kind of get personally affronted. I didn't always say anything, but even, but then when I did it, it was okay.
Hmm.
But so I had this vision of the spaceship, and the voice said it is a young religion, and then it occurred to me that this idea I have that this 2,000-year-old religion is old and no longer able to handle these new times, all these opinions, these views, this doxa that floated around my head with regard to Christianity were simply things of this time. They had no real anchoring in any type of real perspective. If it turns out that humanity, Elon Musk gets his way and we start like colonizing the stars within a century or two, and if Christianity and certain other religions survive that leap into the void and keep evolving, then at some point it'll sound ridiculous to learn that people in the year 2025 or 2020 or whatever thought that Christianity was an old religion.
Hmm.
Like we just have no perspective on it. So what it did was it kind of allowed me to look, that vision allowed me to look at the religion with fresh eyes, without a lot of the kind of patina of familiarity that had accumulated on it in my view. It's weird to say that ayahuasca did it, but ayahuasca, that experience was actually quite instrumental and quite definitive in its pointing me in that direction, which was kind of ironic.
What happens all the time.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Go back, you fool. It says often images
Well, there's a
in
lot of
your book.
disparaging entities,
There's a
or
lot of
very shadowy entities.
there's a shadowy entity that tells the viewer to go back, not to come any closer. I find these pictures particularly effective, and but also sometimes kind of angelic entities saying the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of confusion, I would say.
Yeah,
There's, but I think that again is kind of accurate.
I agree.
Speaking in tongues, for instance, I went to a study group. For the first time, I saw people speak in tongues last week,
Oh, really?
and they interpret those tongues. And
Hmm.
it isn't clear. I mean, from a certain perspective, you could absolutely view it as demonic or inspired.
Hmm.
And I suppose it's that never-ending reevaluation of what's going on
Right.
that is just seems to be true. I mean, you read about certain saints who doubted things not for a day, but for a decade,
Yeah.
doubted the existence of Christ
Yeah.
or God for a
Yeah.
decade
Yeah.
plus, maybe their
Yeah.
entire life. Maybe, in fact, that might be why they're canonized because of that doubt. It's very strange. There's some very strange
It's
elements.
yeah, it is very, very weird when you start to read about the lives of the saints, like Thérèse de Lisieux, the little flower.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
she was,
Yeah,
she, they didn't publicize this far and wide, but she had grave doubts, and
yeah, for like 8 years.
yeah,
Yeah,
and Mother Teresa.
yeah,
And this is not totally off that topic. The book begins and ends with the question, "Where is death?"
yeah, yeah.
and ends with
That is very intentional. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I think that is an interesting. Obviously, the Christian relationship to death is a very, very interesting one, and it's not a pagan one.
when I read that, "Where is death? Just please let me die, my Lord." I'm reminded of what you just told me, that story about when your mom told you about your grandfather and you suddenly became extremely kind of frightened by the idea of
The
living for
positive outcome,
infinity.
right? There you have
Yeah.
the mixing of like I was being proposed, and rightly so, the positive outcome, and it was taken as the most dreadful.
Yeah.
It still gives me pause to talk about, but there is that suspicion, almost like a Gnostic demiurge suspicion. Uh, if I'm being completely honest, that like I've met people who speak about certain things related to faith so confidently, it's
Mhm.
bizarre to me. I don't think I
Yeah.
can ever speak with the confidence they have.
No.
And yeah, that it it is a struggle. And I think the mixing of those things, yeah, it just occurred to me. It's funny to be, when you're young, that's supposed to alleviate my concern. And it made my concern worse. Now, I'm not blaming my parents at all. It's
No.
impossible double blind circumstance they put in. But I think that any image that I felt settled into just like, how do I word it? Any image that felt settled, I guess. I tend to try to go back in
Hmm.
and change it. Um,
Just so it moves, so
yeah,
that
or that it
yeah.
felt honest in some sense.
Right.
That it didn't feel sentimental and because Christianity is a deeply radical. I mean, it's just if you really want to get to the core, it's the thing it is radical.
Agreed.
It's almost so radical it's
Yeah.
impossible to live, and
Yeah.
those who did, their lives are wild, I would say. So there is a neutering that can occur, especially visually, in modern Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm saying is I didn't want any image to feel neutered in that sense. It should be unsettling, I would say. At the church I go to now, someone just placed some flowers at there's a crucifix towards the back, and I guess someone put some flowers between his feet, right?
Right.
Christ's feet. And so you have bloodied, grotesque nail in the foot, and
Right.
then these flowers.
Yeah.
It struck me as so dense
Yeah.
in every way that,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, I don't even think the person putting it there realized how this, like, if you want to really see it with fresh eyes, it is it's hard to comprehend what's going on there.
Yeah,
A
it
dead
is.
man bleeding out, nails, flowers.
Flowers.
It,
Yeah.
and like I didn't see it when I was younger, like you said.
We're just acculturated to it. We don't see it.
And it's super bizarre. It's
Yeah.
to have little versions of a man tortured on a cross, on
Yeah.
your neck, on your earring.
Yeah.
It's
I'm wearing one right now.
it's surreal. It is surreal
It
to
is.
me.
And to think that that's your reward for doing things right.
Well,
Is
that's
that
the beauty.
you
Yeah.
may get nailed to a cross.
Well, and beyond that, every betrayal imaginable will occur. And yeah, it is because you did it right, because you did the right thing.
Yeah. It's a perplexing and, like you say, troubling religion, and in kind of like documenting at least this phase of your journey through it, you've done us, I think, a really great service. I read this.
I hope
This
so.
book to me is it's like a book of visual psalms. You know?
Psalms, yeah. I mean, I used to talk about koans a lot in my work.
Yeah. Well, psalms are
And
like koans.
it's true.
They're
But
not
but
like,
there's a
yeah.
different.
Well,
I think
certainly they're different.
Yeah.
I guess parables are more like koans. Some of the parables, but psalms are more like they're psalms. They're their own genre. But yeah, I guess you could make an argument that these are more koans than psalms.
No, I don't. I wouldn't use
But
it for this book. But my older work, that was a thing I was after, a feeling I was after.
right.
But I don't. I think I'm after a different feeling. There's a kind of emptiness that's being sought as the end result of a koan. I don't seek that.
No.
I don't want emptiness. I don't. I'm very suspicious of that as the place to end up, I guess, at this point. So like I know that this book, which it isn't even clear what it is in some sense or how it should be read, will be a bridge to future work that it'll be a shift.
Right.
I think there's a not a nihilism in the prior work, but there is a despair. There's like an energized foolishness. There's a real intent in all the characters or the beings.
Yeah.
But there's a twistedness of the outcome often that is, I mean, actually, as I think about it, there's always a high and low play. Like things feel like they're going up and down at the same time.
Right.
I can't help but feel that is part of how I was raised and part of that Christian idea, or at least how I interpreted it. But I think the next books I'm going to make are definitely going to be related to children or kids' books, and something in this book bridges the gap. I don't know how yet, but it's too real to avoid. I don't.
So it's a birth of sorts, a messy birth of something.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the methodology, if we want to speak of the mundane, is interesting with this book. It was really an exercise. You know, I now that I have a more quote unquote mature life, I have to find time to make things.
Right.
I used to just live in it. I used to just marinate all day in a book. And you get different outcomes from those things. Now I have to be more, I don't know how to word it without making it sound,
well, more deliberate, more focused for shorter periods of time.
you got to be a little more systematic.
Right.
And you have a different set of problems. You have to figure out how to live within those small moments and to do it in a larger structure.
I used to, before I had kids, like I could afford to make tons of false starts and mistakes.
True.
And that was part of the process, was just exploring. Let's go down there, see what happens. Let's go down here. I find that I can't afford I mean, even financially, I can't, like, literally can't afford to make big mistakes anymore because
Yeah.
I live off this stuff. So when I sit down to write, I need to produce something of value. And at first, this was very frustrating and paralyzing. But now, I guess I'm just good at picking my moments and really making sure that I store up the energy I need to produce something of at least like reasonable value when I sit down to do it, because it needs to be, you just need to be a lot more focused. It's just the way it is. But you're also getting something back for that. You know, you're getting, it's great to be an artist or creator, but it's really great to be a creator who has a family. David Lynch passed away this
Yeah.
week, and there was a clip that was floating around Twitter of him saying, like, kind of bemoaning the idea that artists need to suffer, that artists need to suffer. Van Gogh, and he just made the very obvious point that if Van Gogh wasn't so depressed, he would have created a lot more paintings. And just really kind of dismissing the idea that you need to be miserable and alone to be an artist. And I kind of agree with him. I used to think that myself. I used to romantically yearn for that type of.
I understand.
Yeah. But you have to generate your own kind of fuel constantly. You have to, and I find that, I didn't really start working seriously until my wife, who wasn't my wife even then, we had kids before we were married, fell pregnant, and suddenly I had, okay, now I have to do something, and I've arranged things so that I have no marketable skills except writing and making films.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to do that, and so there was that pressure, but also I find that you just get perspective. I always said that having children is it's like if you took your liver and your kidneys and put them on a table somewhere, and suddenly they're just as essential to you as they were before, but they're not in your body anymore. Mm-hmm. Like parts of you are like moving around the world out there. You're distributed. You're out there. You're connected to something that's not just, the space between your ears. And I've found that tremendously helpful in my own creative work, for sure.
Yeah. I think that everything clicks if you are honest and sober-minded about it. Everything clicks into the proper hierarchy when you have a child.
Right.
And I think when I was making this book, part of the realization was art is not God, and the conflation is a convenient one. I used to make the conflation. Mm-hmm. Now I feel more than ever that I'm honest about where art fits into life itself.
Right.
And it just simply is not. It never has been. It never will be. It's part of a kind of modern perspective that we are we are gods, and thus we venerate those who kind of mimic the activity. Mm-hmm. Of course, they themselves were created, and they create from the material of this plane. So they are obviously sub.
Said.
Yeah.
You know that Tolkien essay?
No, I don't.
On fairy stories, yeah, he has this concept of sub-creation. That the artist is a sub-creator.
Yeah, because that's objectively true.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no debate. I mean, if you want to be logical, it's just fundamentally true, and it's a humbling thing that I don't know how I didn't see it before, and I think that will only make, I hope, my art better is the putting it in its right place, in the long term.
Right.
I think when things are in their proper place, everything flourishes.
Well, I'm going to look at this book as a book of Psalms. I just like thinking of it
I like
that
that.
way. Yeah.
I think it is meant to be opened in a kind of non-sequential manner.
Yeah.
It's not a sequential book in that sense.
And
Um,
it's so honest that it feels like it I mean this in the most positive way. It laments. It's
there's some lamentations.
yeah. There's some lamentations, there's some praise, there's some it's a beautiful, multifaceted, interesting as art and interesting from a theological perspective. Just a really great,
I think
really
I
great piece
struggled
of
with
work.
even in this from like what it is. I think I called it a book of visions at a certain point.
Right.
Book of Psalms is interesting. I still don't really know what to. It's not really an art book in the sense of it's not just like.
Is it a comic?
No, I won't give it that because I don't think I earned that in some ways. And I don't like to stretch. I already stretch the notion of a comic a lot with like some kind of anti-narrative elements. I don't want to obliterate the category. It does nobody
Right.
any good. Uh, no, I don't think it's a comic because although there's relationships between the images,
Right.
that they're not.
They're
It's
not
not
narrative.
not narrative enough to. But although I mean, it should feel as if there is a kind of character the viewer
Yeah.
pops into these places because it was kind of made in that way. That
Right.
because some images really are just scenes; they're not. But there should feel like a kind of skipping about. That's why I use visions, like a flickering vision,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that a dream can be.
Yeah.
Although I find that I begrudgingly get considered surreal,
Mm-hmm.
but I have to accept that. I think that's fine.
Well, when an artist, I was thinking about this with regard to David Lynch again, whom I obviously like his films a lot. This was at the Patreon office hours we had for Weird Studies with the $9 patron people, and somebody pointed this out, and it's a thought I'd had before too, is that people call David Lynch surrealist, but I think that for good and for ill, what he was after was realism. I never liked surrealism as a concept. I don't like their manifestos. I don't like the movement very much. But I do think that if you were to try and capture what it is like to be in this world, try to capture a shard of reality in an artifact, be it a song or a painting or a visual psalm or whatever, it's not going to look like a Polaroid. It's not going to look. It's not going to look like a surveillance camera. It's going to combine the physical world and the spiritual world, because we live in that intersection. It's kind of what we were saying at the beginning: quality and quantity. That's just another boring way of putting it, but
yeah, a child brings that really to light. It's of course. Then it also brings to light how helpless you are.
Right.
How helpless they are makes it very obvious how helpless you are. That they depend on you so much. Of course, in Christianity, this is often analogized as your dependency upon God's favor, etc. Which seems about right to me. At least you get humbled to a degree, and it starts to feel right.
Maybe that's a good closer. That felt good.
It could be.
Could be. I have to go walk my dogs.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. All right, man.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Talk soon.
Have a good night. As always, music by Dori Bavarsky and Mingja Chen. I'm not sure who's up next. It's been a little chaotic, a little less regular on the release. So I appreciate the patience and the support. Have a good week.